Hi, so I'm the digital archivist at the Arkansas History Commission, and the reason why I chose Clara McDermott is that last year at the History Commission we relaunched our online digital archives with various themes, and one of the themes is Arkansas women's history. And in the process of researching for that digital collection, I kept coming across Clara McDermott, and that's kind of what inspired me to do a talk on her. So. I was initially focused on Clara's suffrage and temperance work. After all, she was one of the early movers and shakers in Arkansas suffrage. But as I began to research Clara, I became interested in her personal life, her family, and her husband, George. On a personal level, what I found made me both admire Clara and empathize with her. I just couldn't do a talk solely on her work without talking about her life as well. Another reason for my interest is that as I researched, I realized much of what's been written about Clara hasn't been entirely accurate. To date, Bernadette Cahill has done the most research on Clara and has, to my mind, the one and only accurate timeline of events for Clara's life. She is most definitely the foremost authority on Clara McDermott. The inaccuracies have lent a more glamorous view of Clara than perhaps is true. That isn't to say that she didn't mightily contribute to the suffrage movement in Arkansas, because she really did. But until recent years, Clara has been depicted as a female attorney from Kansas City who was used to having the right to vote, who traveled to Arkansas with her husband, and upon arriving, discovered she was no longer able to practice law or to vote. Much of this is not accurate, though, and we'll tackle that in this talk. Finally, researching the McDermotts was somewhat difficult at times because there are gaps in years where I really couldn't find a lot about them as of yet. Half of my research came from newspaper accounts, the Gazette, the Democrat, and the Woman's Chronicle, which is actually housed here at the old State House, and it's the suffrage newspaper that existed from 1888 to 1893 here in Little Rock. So, having said that, Clara Alma Cox was born December 11th, 1847 in Noblesville, Indiana, to John Thomas Cox and Catherine Rowan Allison Cox. She was the second oldest of 6 children. Overall, Clara came from strong stock. Her grandmother, Lydia Cox Sexton, was an abolitionist, an early temperance worker, and a minister. In fact, she was the first elected pulpit speaker in the United Brethren Church and is considered to be one of the first legally ordained female ministers in the United States. In her later years, Lydia served a year as chaplain for the Kansas State Penitentiary. At the age of 72, she wrote her autobiography, chronicling the difficulties in her early years, which apparently were very, very bad, and her calling to the ministry and the difficulty in making the decision to follow that calling. She continued her ministry, preaching almost every night well into her 90s. In fact, there was a newspaper article, I think the Boston Globe, that talked about every night, almost every single night, she was preaching well into her 90s. Clara's father, John, had a long and varied career, or rather a long and varied series of careers. According to a biography of Cox in Cutler's History of Wilson County, Kansas in 1883, his work included teaching, editing a Whig newspaper, surveying and helping to lay out the town of Ottumwa, Kansas, as well as several other Coffee County towns. He served as a clerk on the U.S. Pension Office in Washington, D.C., a clerk on the Kansas State Legislature, did the pen work for the Great Seal of Kansas for the Kansas State Engraver, served in the Civil War, worked as an Indian agent, a real estate agent, an insurance agent, an attorney, a hotel proprietor, and a merchant. He served for 2 years as secretary of the U.S. Senate Committee on Public Lands, and for a time he lived here in Little Rock, where he was a census taker in 1880. After moving back to Kansas, he became a justice of the peace. This, by the way, is a short list. Clara's family were staunch abolitionists and supporters of temperance and women's rights. Consequently, Clara was raised to be an educated female with strong political opinions in the 19th century, which really kind of unique, especially in the South. During the Civil War, she was a student at Ottumwa College, sometimes referred to as Ottumwa Christian College and Western Christian University. It had several names, didn't last very long, and possibly studied to become a teacher, because in the 1865 Kansas State Census, Clara is listed as a 17-year-old school teacher. On August 27, 1866, she married George Washington McDermott at the Methodist Episcopal Church here in Little Rock, where George had been stationed after the Civil War. She was 18 years old, and he was 22. George, born in 1843 in Michigan, is said to have come from a wealthy family. I couldn't find proof of that, but I kept finding that said over and over again about him. Before his marriage, he had fought with the Union Army during the Civil War, first serving as a private in Company G of the 5th Regiment Kansas Cavalry, then as a first lieutenant with the U.S. Colored Regiment in Arkansas, and finally as a captain with Company K of the 54th U.S. Colored Infantry. George was also an ardent abolitionist who believed in African Americans' rights to not only be free, but to live with all the same rights that whites have been afforded. In a February 9, 1919 article in the Arkansas Gazette titled History of Equal Suffrage in Arkansas, Mrs. S.S. Wassell writes about Clara and George. They were very staunch leaders of the Republican Party and abolitionists of the most pronounced type. They believed in equality for all people, regardless of sex or color. An example of the McDermott's staunch support of racial equality occurred during a parade procession of African Americans in April 1870 in observance of the ratification of the 15th Amendment earlier that year. George was the lone white person to participate in the parade. The Arkansas Gazette, who sincerely hated George for reasons I'll get into in a little while, even had to acknowledge this demonstration and in support of his beliefs, saying, "In the torchlight procession after dark, George McDermott alone, of all the white radicals in the city, had the moral courage to make profit of his person the dusky line to evidence his belief that he considers himself no better than a Negro." The Gazette goes on to say, "When it came to running the gauntlet of eyes on the streets, none but McDermott was brave enough to bear that test." The Gazette also takes a swipe at George, saying that he was at the back of the procession to no doubt slip away unnoticed, because they couldn't help to get a dig in. They really didn't like him. During the first 6 years of their marriage, Clara and George would have 2 daughters, Clara Lily and Katie Josephine. George worked as a Pulaski County clerk in Little Rock, and while raising her daughters, it's been said that Clara supported causes of both temperance and suffrage, but especially temperance through the WCTU. From the outset, George's tenure as county clerk was a controversial one. He was accused of various types of unethical behavior, including fixing elections and withholding information from the public and the press. On December 10, 1872, the Gazette wrote, "No information could ever be obtained from him if he did not see proper to give it. He is alone scrip at will, and no man today knows the financial condition of the county." George was passionately immersed in his political beliefs, many of which were considered radical at the time. His views on race alone set him apart from others in Little Rock. He was also a supporter of Joseph Brooks, who had broken away from the established Republican Party in Arkansas and led a faction of Republicans called the Brindle Tails. This plays into the Brooks-Baxter War, and I'll get more to George's part in that just in a bit. There's a paragraph in an 1893 book called The Brooks-Baxter War, A History of the Reconstruction Period in Arkansas by Charles Cuddick, that discusses George's participation in a rally given by Brooks at Little Rock City Hall on March 2, 1872. And it goes on to say, Tom Henberry, which is a friend of George's, and George McDermott were pressed clear to the platform and shouted themselves hoarse. George's political affiliation put him at direct odds with many Arkansans, especially in Little Rock, and most especially with the Arkansas Gazette, who viewed him as an unethical radical. In the fall of 1871, Clara and George's life would change drastically. On November 7th of that year, their eldest daughter, Lily, fell ill. For the next 10 days, Clara and George watched helplessly as she steadily grew worse. Lily's condition never improved, and on November 17th, she died. Her funeral was held the next day in the family home at Center and 14th Streets, and she was buried in Oakland Cemetery. 3 days later, after Lily's death, their youngest daughter, Katie, also fell ill. On November 10th, 10 days later, she too died. She was also buried in Oakland Cemetery. In the space of 13 days, Clara and George had lost both of their children. Clara was roughly 4 months pregnant at the time. The girls' death notices in the Arkansas Gazette were tiny, so much so that I almost overlooked them. Neither gave any reason for their cause of death. And it surprised me because a lot of times when you see that, you might not see a huge mention with the first child, but having the second child die so quickly, I figured there would be more of a mention, and there was not. I got lucky, though, in that although the History Commission doesn't have state death records, we do have a small number of county death records from Pulaski County, and 1871 is one of those years, so I was able to locate their county death records. Lily's cause of death was listed as something called angina maligna. It's not an illness I've ever heard of. When I did some more research, I discovered it was a severe respiratory ailment. Katie's illness was listed as croup. Both were listed as having been ill for 10 days each. Considering the short time span between their deaths and that the length of time for their illness had been listed as exactly 10 days, I assumed that both had been misdiagnosed and that they were actually sick with something communicable, epidemic. In a discussion with a coworker whose specialty is medical history, it was suggested that angina maligna sounded a lot like diphtheria. There were, in fact, a number of diphtheria cases in Little Rock at that time. There were also numerous cases of death caused by croup and pneumonia. Lily's was the only case of angina maligna that year that I could locate during that time period. I'm inclined to think that probably diphtheria was their cause of death. And I'm not a medical expert, but just based on what I've read, it makes sense. The following year of 1872, 2 important things happened. On March 11th, George and Clara welcomed their third child, a son, George Cox McDermott. And in November, George Sr. lost his re-election bid to continue as Pulaski County Clerk to James R. Rowland, the first African-American to be elected Pulaski County Clerk. The Gazette, of course, was gleeful over George's loss. On January 2nd, 1873, under the title McDermott and the County Clerkship, the Gazette wrote, "Everything is quiet and peaceable at the county clerk's office, and McDermott is out at last. Mr. Rowland, new officer, took possession of the office yesterday, and we trust will make a more efficient officer and be better liked by the people than the last occupant." The November 1870 elections, in which he was accused of what amounted to election fraud, was the beginning of the end of George's stint as county clerk. George frequently found himself facing lawsuits over his conduct during the election. So basically he was accused of, because he represented one side of the political faction of the Republicans, of fixing the election for that side and not basically giving the correct election results from the campaign. By 1872, he even faced impeachment over that election, and then he was a featured player in the impeachment of Governor Powell Clayton in April 1871. The Arkansas Gazette, who I've mentioned previously that they really disliked George, said of the possibility of the impeachment, "We're satisfied of the truth of most of the charges, and we would not shield the clerk." The impeachment didn't happen, though, as he was elected out. He was voted out. It's hard to say if George actually was an ethical one while in office, but in the years after he left office, he faced a series of lawsuits in relation to his work as Pulaski County Clerk, including two cases, State v. McDermott and Fitch v. McDermott. He was accused of withholding, in these cases, he was accused of withholding what appears to be refusing to turn over county papers and books. The lawsuits and these troubles over his work as Pulaski County Clerk plagued him for years after his tenure ended. In fact, I found as these cases went on to 1881, if you can believe that. It's like on and on. After his election loss, George would establish a real estate business with his brother-in-law, C.W. Cox, who was an attorney. The following year, in 1874, George found himself in the middle of the Brooks-Baxter War, supporting, of course, Joseph Brooks. The Brooks-Baxter War, if you don't know, was an armed conflict between two Republican factions in Arkansas, the Brindletales and the Minstrels. The conflict sprang from the 1872 gubernatorial election when Elisha Baxter was elected governor. Supporters of Baxter's opponent, Joseph Brooks, alleged that Brooks had actually won the election, not Baxter, and so a war essentially broke out. Much of the war was fought between these two factions on the streets of Little Rock and on the lawn outside this building. In fact, the Lady Baxter is from that conflict. George was sent to St. Louis to obtain weapons and ammunition for Brooks, and in fact, a newspaper article mentioning his visit appeared in the St. Louis Times and was later referenced by the Arkansas Gazette. The St. Louis Times described George as a quiet, unassuming little gentleman who was unobtrusive in his manner and, as a general thing, very reticent. He attracted but little attention. The Times article goes on to say that Brooks had appropriated $50,000 from the state treasurer and auditor with his money, and with this money, George purchased 2,000 Springfield rifles and 13,000 rounds of ammunition. The rifles were shipped back to Little Rock in boxes labeled Arkansas State Reports, and the ammunition was shipped in boxes labeled whiskey, with the mark of a Little Rock liquor store called J. Garibaldi and Company. Let me just state, the liquor company did not see that coming. Apparently they had no idea that was going to happen because it got delivered to them, and then people came over very quickly, grabbed the boxes, and went back to the State House. And I will say it's important to note that the liquor store was across from this building. In the end, Brooks's attempt to take by force the governorship failed. Consequently, George's stance during the Brooks-Baxter War put him in an even more unpopular, precarious position with many Arkansans, especially in Little Rock, and most especially with the Arkansas Gazette, who never got over their dislike for him. The next several years seem to have been quiet for the McDermotts, or at least there isn't a lot of information until about 1878 for them. On October 29th of that year, 1878, the McDermotts lost their home at Arch and 2nd Streets to a fire. Around 4 a.m., Clara awoke to the smell of smoke. She immediately woke her husband and her parents, John and Catherine, who were living or staying in the house with George and Clara. It was quickly discovered that the fire had originated in a second-story closet adjoining a fireplace. Mr. Cox left the house and hurried to a nearby city hall to sound the fire alarm. Unfortunately for George and Clara, the fire department was very slow to respond and the house was destroyed. George, according to the Democrat, Arkansas Democrat, article about the fire later that day said that George was considerably overcome by the smoke. And apparently there was some sort of controversy over this because there was an ongoing problem about the firemen not putting out fires in certain areas of the town based on insurance purposes or insurance reasons or companies they belonged to, and so that was why they were slow to respond, and there was quite an outcry when they lost their home. By 1880, George began to show signs of mental illness, leaving Clara to take over his part of the real estate business. I don't know if George's issues were strictly medical and biological or if the difficulties of the previous 2 decades of his life finally caught up to him. From fighting and surviving a war, bearing 2 children, enduring a huge amount of strife in his job, and then losing a home to fire, maybe it became too much. or then again, in the 1800s, you were exposed to lead and formaldehyde, and you never know what the cause is, because it was later in life is when he became ill. But in 1881, without a formal declaration of insanity, he was sent to St. Vincent's Institute, a mental institution in St. Louis. In George's later institutionalization papers, his doctor, Dr. E.D. Ayers, claimed that George was sent to St. Vincent's without a formal declaration of insanity at that time. This first stay was brief, lasting only a year. He came back home to Little Rock, but it soon became apparent his condition hadn't improved. I tried to look for mentions of George in local papers to see if his condition had been publicly acknowledged, but wasn't able to find anything. In an 1885 court case, though, Gress v. McDermott, George's ongoing mental issues came to a head. He was sued by a man named R.B. Gress, who claimed George owed him money. Essentially, it's a longer story than that, but for sakes of shortness. Over the course of time it took for the case to be adjudicated, George's condition had worsened to such an extent that the plaintiff requested George be assigned an attorney ad litem in order to finish the case. George's brother-in-law, C.W. Cox, who was an attorney, stepped in as guardian ad litem to represent George. The court protested this self-appointment and appointed its own attorney ad litem. Eventually, his brother-in-law was reassigned, and throughout the case, George never once represents himself. In fact, he's referred to as a lunatic, though not judicially declared. This court case clearly leads to his institutionalization. In April 1870, George's family decides to institutionalize him. Dr. E.D. Ayers, who I mentioned before, George's longtime physician, would state in an affidavit, "It is my opinion that he is mentally incapable of properly managing his business affairs and should have a guardian appointed by the court." The judge agreed, and on April 1887, Clara's brother, C.W. Cox, was appointed George's legal guardian. Diagnosed with chronic mania, George was finally declared legally insane and was sent back to St. Vincent's Institute in St. Louis. George would spend the rest of his life in and out of mental institutions and veterans hospitals, first at St. Vincent's Institute in St. Louis, then in the U.S. National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers in Kansas. He actually spent a couple of stints there, being admitted in June of 1899 for 6 months and then again in 1905. And finally in Washington, D.C. at the Government Hospital for the Insane. Eventually, his son would be appointed his guardian, and he would spend the last years of his life there. As a side note, this hospital would eventually be renamed St. Elizabeth's Hospital and would house several well-known presidential assassins, including John Hinckley Jr. and Charles Guiteau, who killed President James A. Garfield. George died there on August 18, 1917, at the age of 75 from dementia, nephritis, and arteriosclerosis. 3 days later, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. It's interesting to note that after George's institutionalization, Clara no longer acknowledged George as living, at least in local city directories. She listed herself as widowed. And then later years, she began referring to herself as Mrs. C.A. McDermott instead of Mrs. George W. or Mrs. G.W., which was really the tradition for women who considered themselves widowed. It's difficult to say what she was feeling about this turn of events in her life: sorrow, frustration, fear, and maybe even some relief. She gives us a glimpse of her feelings in an article that ran many years later on April 16, 1892, in the Woman's Chronicle. In discussing constitutional law in relation to suffrage, Clara says, "A few laws regulating domestic infelicities in which women have some protection would be in far better form. One or the other, tranquility or felicity, begins on the marriage day. The woman is linked to him in will or woe." After initially dealing with financial difficulties, which involved paying 2 years' worth of unpaid federal taxes, the years after her husband's institutionalization ended up being a time of renewed energy for Clara. She very quickly threw herself into the work of suffrage and temperance. Just to give a little background information on the fight for suffrage in Arkansas, the suffrage movement actually began fairly early, as early as 1868, in fact, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. Miles Ledford Langley, a representative from Clark County, made a motion during the 1868 Arkansas Constitutional Convention calling for all citizens 21 years of age who can read and write the English language be eligible to the elective franchise and entitled to equal political rights and privileges. The following day, he spoke before the Arkansas House of Representatives and addressed the need for women's suffrage, but was laughed down. In September 1881, Lizzie Dorman Filer organized the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association in Eureka Springs. Filer was a Massachusetts native who had actually been a lawyer, and from what I can find is considered probably the first woman to openly practice law in Arkansas. Filer dissolved the group 4 years later in 1885 because of illness, and then a month later passed away. So the tracks for Clara's involvement in the fight for suffrage had been laid. In February 1888, with a group of 13 women, Clara organized her own Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association in Little Rock. Bernadette Cahill theorizes in her Pulaski County Historical Quarterly article, The McDermott House, Early Ownership History of a Significant Structure in 19th Century Little Rock History, that it was likely organized at Clara's house on Center Street. It's interesting to note that the Woman's Chronicle, the suffrage newspaper based in Little Rock, began 1 month later. Within a year, the group would boast 67 members and would eventually be renamed the Arkansas Equal Suffrage Association, or the AESA. It was also during this time that Clara started to give some thought to studying law. Throughout my research, I saw countless references to Clara practicing law in all the secondary sources that I came across. In article after article, it was said that Clara practiced law before her move to Little Rock, where she married George, and that she subsequently was disappointed upon finding that Arkansas would not allow her to practice. Several more articles often also mention Clara obtaining her law degree in Michigan and practicing law in Little Rock in her later years, and at least one of these articles was fairly early on. In the February 9th, 1919 Arkansas Gazette article I mentioned earlier by Mrs. S.S. Wassell, Wassell states, "She was the first woman in the state to hold a license to practice law, but the law did not permit her to practice in the courts. She opened an office in the Dinkler 55 building, now known as the Falk building, and put out a sign, 'Legal services rendered to any woman free of charge.'" Although I found multiple references to this, I wasn't able to find proof of it. In an effort to at least determine if Clara could have practiced law, I contacted the Kansas State Archives, the Kansas City Public Library, the University of Michigan's law school, and both law schools here in the state to determine the truth. Kansas, as of right now, has found no mention of Clara ever practicing law in Kansas before her marriage to George. And to be honest, she was 17 before, at the time, and she was 18 when she got married. So I'm not inclined to believe that. But anyway, in fact, as previously mentioned, the 17-year-old teacher, her father is actually listed as the attorney in 1865. So it could be that Clara assisted her father in his law practice on the side, or at the very least began an apprenticeship in law under his tutelage. If this was true, it would lend some credence to Clara's alleged disappointment in not being able to practice law in Little Rock. But again, as of yet, I haven't been able to establish that. What I do know is that in the fall of 1889, Clara's son, George Jr., left for college to attend the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and Clara joined him. They stayed for a year. This move is mentioned in several issues of the Woman's Chronicle. On page 2 of the July 21st, 1889 issue of the Woman's Chronicle, the following appeared. Mrs. Clara McDermott of Little Rock expects to enter upon the study of law at Ann Arbor University in the fall. She accompanies her son to that city to take the 4 years collegiate course, and during her sojourn there will occupy her time in that direction. This move was significant enough to garner notice in newspapers outside the state as well. The Terre Haute Daily News ran an article about Clara's plans to attend law school in Michigan on page 3 of their September 30th, 1889 issue, saying, "There is something very pleasant in the idea of mother and son thus pursuing their studies at the same time." In part of a short biography on Clara attached to an 1894 article she wrote about Alaska's Native women, states, "Mrs. McDermott studied law and attended lectures at Ann Arbor, Michigan." So I contacted the University of Michigan's law school, and they were not able to find that Clara ever enrolled in law school there. They did, however, find that George Jr. did enroll as a college student and then went on to obtain his law degree from the University of Arkansas in 1895. He also apparently spent some time at Harvard. In my conversation with Michael MacArthur, a reference librarian at the law school in Michigan, he said it was entirely possible she studied law there without enrolling. He said that in the 19th century, it was less about getting the degree and more about studying the law. He went on to say that state bar associations at the time did not require a degree to practice. They just required some amount of study and or apprenticeship. He used Clarence Darrow as an example of this. Darrow, this goes monkey trial attorney, Darrow had not gotten an actual law degree, but rather had only studied law at Ann Arbor before practicing. Finally, Mr. MacArthur said the University of Michigan's law school admitted its first female student in 1870, so it would have been absolutely possible for Clara to have enrolled or at least audited classes. Ultimately, what we do know is that Clara's father, brother, and son all practiced law. It's possible she'd apprenticed with her father before her marriage, and we also know that at the very least, Clara audited classes at the University of Michigan's law school for a year. She was clearly exposed to the legal profession and had some knowledge of the law. But as of now, I haven't been able to prove that Clara actually hung out a sign inviting women in for free legal advice, not even in the Woman's Chronicle, which is something because I think that had she done that, they would have been really talking about that because they talked about any woman doing anything significant, and that would have been significant. They never mentioned that. I've only ever been able to find anecdotal references to this for secondary sources so far. And also, I'll say Bernadette Cahill has said the same thing in her research, that she has yet to find proof that she absolutely worked as an attorney, and she's not found proof that she was ever licensed. During Clara and her son's year away from Arkansas, Clara didn't step away from her duties as president of the Arkansas Equal Suffrage Association. In February of 1890, she represented Arkansas at the National American Convention on Suffrage in Washington, D.C. The Woman's Chronicle said of her attendance at the convention, Mrs. McDermott is an enthusiastic worker in the cause of equal rights for women before the law and will leave no stone unturned to strengthen the organization in this state. 3 months later, in May, Clara permanently returned to Arkansas and immediately picked up her suffrage and temperance work full force. She began to write occasionally for the Woman's Chronicle. Her earliest article focused on her travels up to Michigan, through the West, and along the Pacific coast with her son. But in the next 2 articles, Clara tackled Arkansas's Constitution and declared it to be federally unconstitutional, as its wording was an open defiance of the U.S. Constitution, which she also took to task. In regards to the U.S. Constitution, she took great exception to a variety of things. She brought up several times the use of the word people and how people was actually, as it turns out, just another word for men. She says in response to a section of the Constitution that refers to the rights of the people to alter or abolish the Constitution, that's a beautiful clause which allows the people to do this, but who in mercy's name who are they calling the people? She also had a huge problem with the phrase to ensure domestic tranquility, saying, "This appears to me the most stupid clause in the whole, just as though men alone could formulate a law in which women have no opinion and ensures domestic tranquility." The entire 2 articles are phenomenal, to be honest. She's very snarky. Both articles are just full of very clever snarkiness. There's one where she goes through basically, I want to say it's the Constitution. Every time they mention the word people, she puts in parentheses, men, men, over and over again. And she has a number of other things that she says that are very funny. But anyway, in February 1891, she traveled again to Washington, D.C. to attend the National Women's Council and National American Suffrage Association. She reported to the national conference that although a great deal of work had been done in Arkansas, not much had been accomplished. She discussed how in recent years Arkansas had taken a step backward in the fight for women's rights, and that ultimately she preferred to talk suffrage to children because they never asked foolish questions as who will take care of us while our mothers are on juries, because that was a question that women got asked. If you get the vote, who's going to take care of your kids if you have to serve on a jury? Which she thought was entirely stupid. While there, she was appointed to the Committee on Southern Work. When she returned to Little Rock, the Woman's Chronicle said Clara brought back glowing accounts of the meetings and that it was a truly good thing to have been there and believed the cause of women's suffrage has made a great stride forward as a result. Outside of her suffrage work, Clara belonged to a number of other organizations. As I previously mentioned, she was very active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, also known as the WCTU, and had been long before the founding of the AESA. She was a state officer of the local WCTU chapter, eventually becoming treasurer of the organization, and she traveled to various WCTU conventions around the country as a representative of that local chapter, including an 1889 national convention in Chicago. In that same year, she provided 2 rooms to the organization in her newly built building on Markham Street, and was quoted as saying on the February 16, 1889 issue of the Woman's Chronicle, "If the various societies of women cannot afford to pay rent for quarters, I will put up a building for their exclusive use," and she did. 7 months later, on September 28, 1899, the Woman's Chronicle wrote, "Mrs. C.A. McDermott, a most zealous worker in the cause of temperance, who is now erecting a handsome brick business block on Markham Street next to the Alice Building, has announced she will donate 2 rooms of the block to the organization." During this time, she also belonged to the Rose City CLSC, which stood for the Chautauqua Literary and Science Circle, the Quapaw CLSC, the Christian Women's Board of Missions, the Women's Educational Aid Society, for which she served as president for a time, and she worked as a matron with the Women's Industrial Home here in Little Rock. In 1892, she attended a suffrage convention in Chautauqua, New York, and then the Mississippi Valley Conference connected with the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association in Des Moines. Apparently, Chautauqua in New York, that was a very interesting a conference, because they had a guy there that was really opposed to suffrage, and he stood up and kind of hijacked the conference at one point and just railed against women and their want for suffrage, and just went on and on, and they had a good amount of fun poking fun at him afterwards. Even some of the men in the audience did. In April 1893, she was reelected as president of the AESA during the state convention in Little Rock. Throughout the 1890s, Clara suffered from rheumatism, forcing her to occasionally leave Little Rock for Mount Nebo or Hot Springs in order to find some relief. In the fall of 1893, the Woman's Chronicle announced that Clara was too ill to travel to the annual suffrage convention in Washington, D.C. But in 1895, Clara was, at least for a time, well enough again to travel. By June 1st of that year, she was elected to represent Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi at the WCTU's World Convention in London, England. In between her work, Clara and her son George traveled extensively. Over several years, they traveled all over the U.S. to Cuba and Alaska, and then after her convention in London, they traveled throughout Europe. After a trip to Alaska, she wrote extensively on the Native women there, and she was really fascinated that the Native Alaska women were had more equality within their tribal culture than white women did. She found that really interesting. There's not a lot written about Clara after the mid-1890s, at least not locally, but I think it's safe to say she was still involved with her various organizations. In July 1899, Clara traveled to Des Moines, Iowa to visit her niece, Clara Johnston. 3 weeks into the visit, she died suddenly of unknown causes on July 22nd. Clara was 51. The next day, her body, accompanied by her son George, was shipped back to Little Rock. 2 hours after Clara's body arrived in Little Rock, a funeral was held at her home at 20th and Center. No, West Spring, different house. The Arkansas Democrat wrote of Clara, "In the death of Mrs. McDermott, Little Rock loses one of its noblest and best beloved women. She was a leader in club work, a woman of broad views and extraordinary mental attainments." The Arkansas Gazette said, "A woman of marked personality and strength of mind." Even that long after, they really had very little to say about Clara. So I kind of figured they held a grudge. At her funeral, Mrs. S.R. Allen, president of the Ladies' Circle of the GAR, gave the eulogy as requested by Clara in her will. Mrs. Allen said, "We may have underestimated her work when she was still a worker, but now we finally recall the truth, that her voice was always eloquent, her pen was always ready in the service of a cause she loved." Sorry, excuse me. Clara was buried in Oakland Cemetery next to her 2 daughters. In her will, Clara left property to her son. She left property and jewelry to her 2 grandsons, Ellis and Roy. To her granddaughter Gladys, she left a bracelet and her house. To her husband George, still alive and institutionalized, she left a sum of $200 to be paid to St. Vincent's Institute for his continued medical care. Her will was witnessed by Dr. Ida Jo Brooks, daughter of Joseph Brooks, and one of Arkansas's earliest female physicians. Clara had spent the last 12 years of her life creating a different existence than the one she'd had by tackling issues that were important to her, almost all of which involved the lives and rights of women. She had worked tirelessly on behalf of these causes and was clearly a driving force in Arkansas's move toward granting women the right to vote. Clara's motivation for this work is best summed up in a quote from her in 1895. "Self-protection is my inherent right. For that protection I demand the ballot. The question is not debatable." Clara's death was a major blow to the suffrage movement in Arkansas. Without anyone else to step into that role, the movement stalled, and it would be 11 more years before another strong suffrage movement would begin again. And of course, in 1918, Arkansas finally allowed women to vote in primary elections and would then become the 12th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the vote. Clara would have loved seeing that. So, anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Tell me again about when you started off, was that her mother or her grandmother who went around preaching?
Oh, her grandmother, Lydia Cox Sexton. She was a very interesting woman, and she wrote an autobiography in her later years. Apparently, her younger years were very bad younger years. She lost a couple of husbands and went through a lot of poverty and pain and difficulty. She ended up being a minister, and yeah, that was her grandmother.
So,
Clara's grandmother.
her mother's?
That would have been it would have been her father's mother, because she married several times, so his name ended up being different than hers, if that makes sense. She was, I think, married 3 times, I think, maybe.
You said she was in the temperance movement as well?
She was.
How involved was she in that? Just in suffrage?
I would say very, very involved. I think she was I think she was more involved in that before the suffrage work, to be honest. And, I mean, the suffrage movement, of course, was tied closely to the temperance movement. That was something that just went hand in hand. So, but I think that was something that she very passionately supported and believed in, and she was very involved in, yeah.
How did the family get to Arkansas?
Well, so George, I'm assuming, so George, during the Civil War, he served with some Kansas units. I'm guessing that he lived in Kansas after being born in Michigan. He lived in Kansas, fought for some Kansas regiments, ended up in Arkansas, served with some Arkansas regiments, and stayed stationed here in Little Rock. So my guess is that he had met Clara in Kansas before ending up in Arkansas, and that's how they married. I think that's what happened.
What about the story about the sign in the window, free daily services? Where do you think that originated?
I've kind of wondered that, and I'm a little torn on this. So I think there's entirely, she may have done that, but the Women's Chronicle did not ever, mention that. And I'm really surprised that never once did they ever say Clara McDermott is offering free legal advice to women in Little Rock. It's never been mentioned. And I think that's odd because there are ads in the papers for women doing other professions and mentions of women doing other professions. I kind of wonder sometimes if maybe some of this is Clara. You know, like I think her intentions were good, but I feel like sometimes some of the stuff I've seen may have been kind of perpetuated by her. And maybe she did offer legal advice. Maybe it was quietly done. I'm not sure.
So where do you see that story? You said you talked about some secondaries.
Well, there are a number of articles written about Clara over the years. There was one written by Tom Dillard in the 1980s. Of course, Bernadette's written several. And some woman who wrote her thesis from, where was she from? Maybe it was Yale that wrote her thesis on Clara McDermott. It was mentioned there. So I kept coming across it over and over again, but none of them gave any proof for why they were saying it. They were citing previous secondary sources, including the 1894 biography attached to her writing about Alaska Native women. None of them ever went to a newspaper article or a record or anything like that. None of them cited that at all. So I thought that was odd.
That's a good little mystery there.
Yeah.
What the origins were, if they keep citing other secondaries.
Yeah.
Start somewhere.
It does, and in 1919, Mrs. S.S. Wassell, who was a massive part of the suffrage movement later on in Arkansas, cited her as having done that, and so I think that they knew each other. I think she was. I think that they knew each other, but I don't know for sure why or how. I don't. Yeah.
How did she support herself, or was she relying on her son? Or
That's interesting. So I kept coming across records of her selling property and land, I think, to, because apparently they had extensive ownership of things. And I keep coming across records indicating her brother was selling stuff for her in order to maybe fund this. And I don't know, I know that she did take over her husband's real estate business. I don't know, maybe she was very good at that too, I'm not sure. But I do come across several things that indicate they sold some of their personal property, and that's part of, yeah, I'm not. I know, and she also provided. She had a nice home. She gave a lot of events at her home. She built a building for organization and offered that up to people. So clearly, she had money coming in from somewhere. After seeing the records about her selling land, even I kind of wondered if maybe there was something more. Maybe her family had money, or I'm not sure. I'm not. George's family did have money, and apparently, actually, in Bernadette's, one of her articles about the house that George and Clara lived in, apparently the first home they lived in had been purchased from George's mother, who ended up in Arkansas too somehow. So I've found plenty of secondary sources talking about George having come from a wealthy family, but not any primary so far.
The houses they lived in still standing?
Apparently the one at West Spring and Center, 14th. Do what? No, I think that the last house she lived in is still standing today, I think. And so, sorry, it's just making noise. I think I did it. But yeah, apparently that house is still standing. Of course, the one they lived on Arch Street burned down. I don't know about the first home they lived in. I'm not sure. Isn't the Folk building the Arkansas Democrat building? Because it's mentioned as one of the buildings that she worked in. I thought that became the Democrat building.
Did the son write anything about his mother?
Not that I can tell. The son was interesting. He married before Clara's death, had 3 children. And after his mother's death, he left the legal profession completely. He didn't do it anymore. He moved his family to Ohio, where he worked first as a professor of mathematics at a college there, and eventually he became head of the Department of Mathematics at that college. And he stayed there for decades and then retired, and he and his family moved to California, and that's where he lived out his life. And I don't know a lot about him past that, but I did find it interesting that he had trained to be an attorney, and once his mother was gone, he left it and never did it again, ever. I'm thinking he was probably an attorney for the sake of his mother, but his passion was something else, maybe. I don't know. Any other questions? No? The thing about Clara that I thought was really interesting is that she had a period of time in her life that was horrible. I mean, it was really bad. Just 2 children and a sick husband and, you know, fire and all these other really bad things that happened to her. And I would imagine a good 15 years of her life that was just really not good at all, really painful and difficult, endlessly painful. And after her husband was institutionalized, she kind of started over from scratch and created her own existence, and I think loved the life that she had. She dedicated herself to causes and worked tirelessly on behalf. Traveled, loved to travel apparently. And I also thought I came across another quote in the process of my research, found it, didn't make note of it like I should have, and then couldn't find it again, where she talks about how it's unfair for women not to have certain rights when their husbands are declared insane, like when their spouses are going through that kind of thing. And it spoke directly to her, because, you know, she was not allowed. Her brother had to do all of the adjudication for that. She just sat back. She couldn't do anything because it wasn't allowed. It wasn't allowed. And so I never could find the quote again. I wish I would have made note of it because it was pretty profound. I don't know why I didn't, but I thought that was really telling. And Clara, I mean, the thing that got me the most is that the early articles written about Clara kind of glamorized her, and that she was this attorney from Kansas who, you know, this enlightened working voting attorney in Kansas who came to Arkansas and found out she couldn't do what she was used to doing, and that wasn't the case. I think in Kansas at the time when she was a teenager, they were allowed to vote in school elections at most. It wasn't an overall, like, you know, they didn't have, there was a lot of inaccuracies, and I found that glamorization of her interesting. I don't know if it was part of her thing that she kind of created her own legacy. I don't know. Anyway, okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I really do. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I was really nervous. Thank you so much.